Good evening, everyone joining us via Zoom. Thank you for taking time out of your schedules to join us here at the City of Port St. Lucie. You're joining the City of Port St. Lucie Parks and Recreation Community Engagement Meeting on our ADA transition plan. So I'm not going to spend my name is Patty Roberts. I'm the Deputy Director here for the Department of Parks and Recreation. And as we go through this journey toward developing our very first ADA transition plan, the idea behind this meeting is to get some public input on choices for accessibility, on what your priorities might be. But I'm not going to be leading this presentation. We have procured the services of a consultant to take us on this journey of an ADA transition plan. And that gentleman is with us tonight. Mr. John McGovern, as well as his senior project manager, Shelley Zuniga, are here. They are going to be presenting. Pardon me? Yes, thank you. They're going to be presenting via the PowerPoint that I hope you can all see tonight, but I do want to offer this out. There will be opportunities for questions and answers from the Zoom piece of it. What I would ask you to do is to use the Q&A feature. So hopefully you've all found that. And what we'll do because of production capabilities is once you put a question in through the Q&A, I will be read that question. I'll repeat it on this microphone, and then our presenter, Mr. McGovern, will respond via the Zoom link. So you'll hear his response to your question. And so without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn this over to John McGovern with the WT Group out of the Chicago, Illinois area.
Thank you very much, Patty, and thank you to Kirby and Sandra for joining the meeting. And as Patty said, this is one of many opportunities for public feedback regarding the City of Port St. Lucie Parks and Recreation Department transition plan. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about what we will cover here tonight. Patty, can you advance? So we've done the introductions. We do have a couple members of the public here. Percy, could you introduce yourself and talk about why you're interested in the transition plan? May have to do this through the chat function.
Those people that are at home on the Zoom, you need to use the Q&A function, not the chat, but the Q&A to respond to John.
So Kersey or Sandra, could you just tell us why you're interested in the transition plan? Patty, I'm going to assume that they have general interests. So if you want to go on to the next slide, we can continue the presentation. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, as all of us know, is a comprehensive federal civil rights law, and it affects all of the 89,000 units of state and local government across the country. And that includes about 10,000 parks and recreation departments. So our scope of work in this project for the Parks and Recreation Department really hinges on three key things. One is conducting access audits of all of the parks and facilities. 2 is this community engagement event and a survey that everybody will have an opportunity to give the department more feedback. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. And then we're also preparing a phased schedule of retrofits known as a transition plan for the department. On the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the ADA itself. And I'll try to focus here on the portions of the ADA that apply to the department and to existing facilities and parks. So the ADA is almost 32 and a half years old from an effective date perspective. It became effective on January 26, 1992, and it was signed into law July 26 of 1990 by President Bush. It's based on 2 earlier federal civil rights laws. One is the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and the second is Section 504 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act. Of interest, the Rehabilitation Act does prohibit discrimination on the basis of disability, but it applies only to departments or cities that receive federal funds. Congress felt they wanted to make the civil rights protections for people with disabilities stronger, so the ADA applies to a city whether it receives federal funds or not. There are 4 key sections in the ADA. Title 1 deals with employment. That's not in our scope of work, but generally it prohibits an employer from discriminating against an employee who has a disability or acquires a disability in the course of their work for the jurisdiction. Second is Title II, and that applies to the city of Port St. Lucie and all of its departments like Parks and Recreation. Candidly, Title II has been the big success story of the ADA. More Parks and Recreation departments have led the way for cities and counties across the country, and for that matter, states across the country, in making parks and facilities and recreation programs accessible. Title III addresses privately owned places of public accommodation. So a coffee shop, a restaurant, a car dealership, a bank, a gas station. All of those are subject to Title III, and all of those are prohibited from discrimination on the basis of disability. A word here about the difference between Title II and Title III is important, though. Congress wanted units of local government to do more and to do it sooner than businesses and nonprofits. So many of the ADA deadlines for local governments are earlier than they are for businesses. And many of the requirements in Title II for local governments are much, much more stringent than the requirements for businesses and nonprofits. And that is the way Congress wanted it, and that's the way the courts have continued to interpret it. Last but not least is telecommunications. When the ADA was signed into law in 1990, not everybody had the capability to text one another. So to a certain extent, this is a good example of a civil rights protection that has become maybe almost an obsolete issue, because if I'm deaf or hard of hearing, all I have to do is pick up my cell phone and I can probably text Patty Roberts at Port St. Lucie Parks and Recreation and talk to her about whatever my Parks and Recreation question is. On the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more detail about Title II. So as I mentioned, Title II is the part of the ADA that applies to units of state and local government. It governs everything the department does, from recreation programs and services to the design of parks to how facilities are operated and designed. So it's very comprehensive. And as you can see in the third bullet point, also applies to existing sites. There is a part of Title II that is crystal clear, and that's that new sites must be fully compliant with whichever is more stringent, the 2010 standards for accessible design or the Florida Accessibility Code. In our work, we incorporated both as we looked at existing sites and facilities, but we also included smart practices. We recognize that many parks and recreation departments like St. Lucie have figured out a way to exceed the minimum requirements and make sites and programs more accessible to and inclusive of people with disabilities. One of the messages that we try to send is that the ADA just sets the floor, not the ceiling. So if Port St. Lucie wants to exceed it and have more than the required number of accessible parking stalls, or have more programs that are inclusive of people with disabilities, then that is a good thing. And the department should be congratulated for that. The third bullet point does talk about existing sites. There was discussion in 1989, 1990 about whether or not units of local government should have to make every existing site accessible. After almost a year's worth of debate, it was determined that that was impractical and would have been too costly. So the compromise is that every existing site must be audited. Therefore, as changes are made at existing sites, so for example, when a playground is replaced because it ages out, then the new construction requirements kick in, and that new playground must be fully compliant with the 2010 standards or the Florida Accessibility Code. On the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about Title II and shift the focus to programs. This was also a piece of our scope of work for the department. We interviewed staff to determine how the department invites, analyzes, and fulfills requests for reasonable modification by people with disabilities so that they can participate in the program. So a couple of points here. Title II makes it very clear that Port St. Lucie Parks and Recreation must make programs available in the most integrated setting. So as an example, if I have a son on the autism spectrum, but I want him to learn to participate with kids who do not have a disability, it's my choice as to whether or not he participates in a summer program or an after-school program alongside kids who don't have disabilities. He can't be required to participate only with other kids who have a disability. The second bullet point is a very powerful part of the act. The department has to make modifications to support participation by people with disabilities. So these are called reasonable modifications. The Title II regulation published by the Department of Justice and the statute itself, as adopted by Congress, includes about 9 or 10 examples. One might be a sign language interpreter for a person who's deaf. 2 might be removing architectural barriers at existing sites for a person with mobility impairments. 3 might be providing more staff training or even a different staff ratio, a better staff ratio for a participant in a program who is on the autism spectrum. So all of these are supported by court decisions and administrative decisions along with settlement agreements. And in our final report to the department, we will have a section dedicated to reasonable modifications. The third bullet point is interesting, and it does have a Florida flavor to it. The department must make contractors and concessionaires agree not to discriminate on the basis of disability. And this is a state of Florida, this really happened situation. So a gentleman who uses a wheelchair goes to a state park. He parks in the accessible parking stall that's operated by the state. He uses the access aisle to get to the exterior accessible route, and he goes to the ticket booth, which is operated by the state and staffed by the state. He buys a ticket for a glass bottom boat ride, something that a lot of us would enjoy. So he wheels down the state pier and he gets to the glass bottom boat, and the operator of the boat, a concessionaire, stands up and said, "Sorry, you're not getting on my boat in that wheelchair." So ask yourself, whose problem is that? Is that the state's? Is that just the concessionaire? Is it both? And if you answer that it's both, then that's the correct answer. So clearly, whenever a Title II entity like the state of Florida or the city of Port St. Lucie enters into an agreement for a contractor or a concessionaire, so if I'm going to teach Zumba out of my studio and it's John Zumba, then I have to sign an agreement that says I'm going to provide modifications and I'm not going to discriminate on the basis of disability. Last but not least, but important, is that the department has to make certain that the processes it puts in place for people with disabilities are not more difficult than the same processes for people without disabilities. Registration is a good example for a program. There's a jurisdiction in another state that recognized that they have to provide reasonable modifications, but they said if you ask for a reasonable modification, you have to call the director of Parks and Recreation. Well, no one else has to call the director of Parks and Recreation. Everybody else can register for the program. If there's room in the program, if they pay the fee, then they're in. So a lot of people with and without disabilities don't like to feel like they're in a position where they have to fight City Hall for the benefits of that local government. So Port St. Lucie does a good job of making these processes the same, but this is one of the subtle, more nuanced parts of the Title II regulation. The next slide switches gears a little bit to what I wish the Department of Justice had named differently, but they didn't, and that's the concept of program access. So for a lot of us, when we hear the word program, we think of a thing that you register for, that you pay a fee for. It meets on every Thursday from 6 to 7 for 6 weeks. But a program is much, much more than that. Congress wanted programs to be broadly defined. And so we interpret that as opportunities provided by the city of Port St. Lucie. So the opportunity for me to cheat at golf at the Saints golf course, that's a program. The opportunity for me to go to a city council meeting, and if I'm a person who's deaf, make public comment with a sign language interpreter there, that's a program. So programs are critical to the notion of compliance with the ADA. There are court decisions kind of out of the realm of Parks and Recreation that say that sidewalks are a program, even though you probably can't come up with a more poured brick and mortar kind of element that a local government runs. So programs, again, key to compliance here, and just remember that they're very broadly defined. DOJ also said, and this is in the third bullet point, that not necessarily all existing sites or site assets must be retrofit. The Department of Justice does not give you a ratio or a percentage, though. So for recurring sites, this tends to become an issue. And I'll give you an example to illustrate it. If Port St. Lucie has a playground that is not accessible, but it has another playground that's a mile away that is accessible, that's perfect for this example. It's okay for Port St. Lucie to leave the inaccessible site the way it is until it, of course, goes in and makes changes at that site, because those changes must be accessible. And the rationale here is that only a mile away, there is another playground with the same types of assets, and those are accessible. In our approach, we recommend that the city use a minimum of one of three of recurring assets will be made accessible. We know this model works. It has been accepted several times by the Department of Justice in settlement agreements. It's been accepted by federal district courts in 3 states. It's been accepted by the U.S. Department of Interior. It's been accepted by the Department of Education. It's been accepted by enforcement agencies in 2 states, state enforcement agencies. So we know it works. In our reports to the department, we will lean heavily on the minimum of one of three. Timing is also important, and that's addressed in the bottom bullet point. If you called the Department of Justice tomorrow and said, how soon do we have to make our existing sites accessible? The answer is as soon as is possible. And that's just not really helpful from a planning perspective. So typically for a Parks and Recreation department, with the wide range of sites that a department like Port St. Lucie has, we'll recommend somewhere between 8 to 11 years to bring all the sites in compliance. We'll talk a little bit more about how we phase those recommendations in a couple of slides. Patty, it looked like we had a couple comments here. There we go. One of the attendees says, as a disabled resident of Port St. Lucie, she's very interested in the city and making this beautiful place, emphasis on beautiful, that we call home, welcoming to all, especially making recreational areas accessible to everyone. So thank you very much, Kersey, for that very positive comment. We do have another comment. Let's see. Somebody who has filled out the survey. Dear members of the City Council, Parks and Recreation, I'm writing to express the profound importance of creating barrier-free, universally designed, wheelchair-accessible recreational parks within our city. As a woman with a disability, I deeply understand the significance of accessible entertainment and recreational spaces for people of all abilities, whether physical, mental, or cognitive. They're essential for fostering a community where every individual feels welcome and valued. Currently, many recreational spaces in our city pose significant challenges for people with disabilities, requiring them to relegating them to the sidelines. So that's a great comment, and that is indeed part of what we're looking at in our work when we audited the sites. On the next slide. Oh, thank you, Betty. We talk a little bit about why we audited facilities, and one of them is exactly responsive to the chat. We do want to make sure that when renovations are planned, that the city and the Department of Parks and Recreation knows where the deficits are so that they can incorporate those into their annual work plans. A lot of the sites, and this is common in Parks and Recreation, a lot of the sites were planned before 1992 when the ADA became effective. And importantly, recreation assets were not addressed by the design standards until 2010. So in most parks, up until 2010, the way you got to a playground or a gazebo or a picnic table was to walk across grass. That obviously will not work for people who have a mobility impairment. Grass is never an accessible surface. I think importantly, though, why audit facilities has a 6-word answer that's best. It's the right thing to do. So that's what Port St. Lucie wanted to do. They want to make sure that their parks and facilities are indeed welcoming to people who have a disability. On the next slide, we'll talk about the transition plan itself. So again, it hinges on the programs, the concept of program access, and it requires 4 things. 1, it requires identification of every deficit. 2, it requires a discussion about how to address that deficit. So as I mentioned earlier, some deficits may be left as is, but most are going to be retrofit. 3rd, it requires the naming of the position that's responsible for barrier removal. And then lastly, it requires the date or phase in which the work will occur. So we use a 3-phase program or approach, and I'll talk about that in another slide or 2 here. On the next slide, we talk about some factors that other jurisdictions have used to determine the order of retrofit. So for the members of the public that are with us today or that are viewing this recording later, tell Port St. Lucie Parks and Recreation whether some of these resonate with you. So one might be the severity of the barrier. So using the example I used earlier, if there is only grass in the park to get to the playground, I'm going to call that a severe barrier. On the opposite side of that is low-hanging fruit. So things that are easy to do with current human and fiscal resources, like restriping parking so that it's the right width, or lowering signs outside of a restroom so they're at the right height, or taking the sign off the door and putting it on the wall where it belongs. Those are all things that the department can likely do with current staff. We've also seen some jurisdictions say, if we're going to have a transition plan, we want the higher priority to include our most heavily used sites. So to a certain extent, I can see the logic there. We do want to make sure, though, that sites that are retrofit are dispersed throughout the city of Port St. Lucie. That's an important transition plan requirement as well. We've also seen other jurisdictions say, if we're going to invest public funds in these retrofits, we'd rather make retrofits to spaces used by the public a higher priority than spaces used only by employees. We didn't have a long talk about this earlier because it's not in the scope of this project. But an employee who does acquire a disability has a completely different approach to making their workspace accessible to them. So if a priority is adopted that places a premium on public spaces, it does not mean that an employee who acquires a disability won't be able to use a space eventually. The next slide includes a couple more factors. How recent is construction? I mentioned that new construction must be accessible. I will tell you that out of the more than 600 units of state and local government that we've worked for, they've all had a new construction asset, and we have found deficits at every single one of them. It might be a slope that's too great in parking. It might be grab bars that are at the wrong height. Shelley will talk about some of this later when she shows you some images of some of the things that we saw at Port St. Lucie sites. Repurposed sites, I don't think this is so much of an issue for you, but we often see buildings that were originally used for one purpose, perhaps it was a school, and are now used as a recreation center. Usually it's a 100-year-old building, which is hard to make accessible under any circumstances. Parks and Recreation departments have also across the country partnered with other entities. It might be another Parks and Recreation department. It might be a nonprofit. It might be a business. So whenever there's a partnership, that tends to wind up being a lower priority because it takes time to get the partners in agreement as to what's going to occur. Last on this slide is complex or costly retrofits. Those two wind up being a lower priority because it just takes time to get to the point where you can fund those retrofits. The next slide wraps up with the last set of transition plan factors that we've seen other jurisdictions adopt. And the first one is important. There are still park and recreation assets that are not subject to a design standard. So the most complex of those is trails, but included with this group are beaches, campsites, picnic areas, viewing areas, and constructed outdoor park assets like a grill, for example. Again, thinking that a picnic table is a program, we will still recommend that some picnic tables at sites be made accessible, that some trails at sites, because trails are a program, be made accessible. So whether we are calling it a smart practice or not, it's still a way for the department to stay in compliance. Speaking of compliance, there is one Title II requirement that says that a department need not make a site accessible when doing so is technically infeasible. In a building, that means that a load-bearing wall or element has to be moved. In a park, it means that naturally occurring steep terrain or some other natural condition like a bog makes compliance unable to occur. The third bullet point talks about historic sites. I want to be clear here. Historic sites are not exempt from the ADA. They must have an access audit, but a jurisdiction can choose to not make the site accessible if doing so will threaten or destroy the historic significance of the site. There is only one office in the state of Florida that can make that decision. It is the State Historic Preservation Officer. That office sometimes delegates that authority to local governments, but it all has to be signed off on by that one office. Last but not least, and this too is an issue here in the state of Florida, are sites that have other protections. So if there's an endangered species and somehow making that site compliant would interfere with that species, or if there are protected flora and fauna, and somehow meeting the technical requirements would endanger the flora and fauna, then the agency need not do it. It doesn't prohibit them from doing it, but they need not take that step. The next slide are some of the observations that we saw. So Shelley Zuniga is our senior project manager, and she oversaw the audits of sites. And she's going to take over here now and just kind of walk you through some of the things that we saw. I want to make sure everybody understands this is not a deep dive into any one site. These are just intended to illustrate some of the things that we saw. And Shelley will talk about the importance or the meaning of what she saw at those sites.
Hello, happy to be here with you this evening. Patty, if you could go to the next slide. So one of the first points of entry at most parks and sites is the parking lot. And what the standards dictate as far as accessibility are two different things. One is how many of something should be provided. So if, doesn't say you have to have parking, but if you have parking, a certain number of those stalls must be designed as accessible stalls. So then the second part of it is, what does that look like then? So what we're measuring when we go out there in the field is the type of surface that it's on. So is it firm and stable? The width of the stall, the width of the adjacent access aisle. Is the slope, as noted here, the slope at Botanical Gardens and the access aisle exceeds the allowable 2.08%, making it too steep. The other picture illustrates an area at the OL Peacock Senior Lake, where it's just a gravel lot with grass adjacent. So there is no designated or designed accessible stalls. So if someone should go there, they don't necessarily have that specified point of entry that would connect them to a route to amenities. So it is really important where you are providing an amenity that you look at how and where you can provide accessibility. Next slide. So once you're there, you've parked, you need to look for an accessible route that connects you from that parking stall to the amenities provided. So what an accessible route looks like is it has a specific width, so 36 inches wide. Again, that surface needs to be firm and stable. And the slopes are really important here. So what I've shown on the left is a cross slope. So it's going perpendicular to travel is 2.5. Again, that 2.08 is the maximum allowable. So if you've ever pushed a cart or if you use a mobility device and you've ever moved along a path that has a slope to one side or the other, it's really challenging to try and stay on a straight path if you're sloping off to the side. The second picture then represents inaccessible surface. So as John mentioned earlier, grass is never an accessible surface. Dirt is never an accessible surface. So here at McCarty Ranch, where you can pull up and you fill your camper with water, the surface that leads up to that amenity is grass and gravel. So it is not an accessible surface. Next slide. So within the parks, which is what we did a lot, what we're looking for again is a route to amenities. So sometimes it's just something as simple as the garbage is placed in the wrong place. So that picture there represents a beautiful sidewalk path that leads around the racquetball courts, but the garbage can was placed in the passage. So that would cause someone to have to go around and into the grass to get to that racquetball court. Not every fix has to be structural. Some of it's just training of staff. The other picture represents an amenity offered at most parks, which is a drinking fountain. So The ADA requires where you provide drinking fountains, you must have a high bowl, meaning a bowl that a standing person would use, so I don't have to bend down too far if I have a bad back, or the lower accessible bowl. And that one has a lot more standards that applies to it, such as the one represented here. The water flow needs to be at least 4 inches high so that, again, if I have limited trunk strength, I'm not having to dive into the bowl to get some water to drink. Next slide. So within parks, we often see the play areas. John mentioned those before. We're looking for one of three. One of the primary areas where we see some challenges is the surface used. So here on the left, the slide shows a sloped entry using a rubber mat into an engineered wood fiber surface. So again, we're looking for a milder slope into that surface. This shows a 7.3 running slope. We want something to be a little bit milder than that, and then leading into a firm and stable surface. Most times, folks who use mobility devices find that loose fill surface very challenging to traverse. If it is maintained firm and stable, meaning it's filled often, it's raked, watered, and compacted, it can be maintained as accessible, but that's a challenge. That's very time intensive. On the right side, again, relative to the fill, as it gravitates out of the playground in shoes and pockets and gets kicked out by kids, it's going to create some of those changes in elevation at the edge, as you can see, which then make it more challenging for someone who either uses a walker or uses a mobility device. They now have that trip hazard that if the fill was maintained higher, it wouldn't be there. Next slide. So another thing that we looked at are restrooms, both in facilities and in parks. There's a lot of things that we look in at the restrooms. We look at the main portion of the room, sink heights, mirror heights, reach ranges to paper towel dispensers and hand dryers. Primarily, though, we're going into those accessible stalls and we're looking at whether those aspects are mounted correctly and if the dimensions are there. So this picture shows the lack of pipe wrap at the sink there at Kiwanis Park. That being important in that if I have no sense of feeling in my legs and there's some abrasive elements, I could injure myself and not be aware of it. The one on the right shows the toilet paper dispenser that's mounted a little bit too close to the toilet. Again, the importance of that specific placement is if I have low trunk control and I have to lean too far or twist too much, I could potentially fall. So it's very important that that paper towel dispenser is in a very specific location. Next slide. Do we need to switch interpreters at this point? Are you good? Are you? Okay. All right. Okay. The last group of slides talk about unique sites. So I think John mentioned where you have unique sites within a system, you can't really provide that duplicated experience at the other parks. So the Botanical Gardens provided in Port St. Lucie, it's a beautiful site that's unique to Port St. Lucie. So the importance of addressing those issues is a little bit higher because that is the only place that you can experience that. I'm not sure if you're seeing the same thing I am. It's somewhat blurry, but again, what this addresses is routes. So I believe that picture on the left shows the route from the pathway to the garden center service counter, which I believe is a wood chip surface. Again, very hard to traverse if you have limited mobility. Anytime you have any sort of walkways and paths over time, you're going to get some changes in level that will develop as your sidewalk panels shift. So those are something Oh, there we go. Now it's clear. Those are something that you just need to maintain over time. And then certainly where you have foliage, and you're going to have that at the Botanic Gardens, obviously, just making sure you're trimming that back enough so that you have a 36-inch wide pathway to get to the different amenities that are provided. Next slide. So I'm going to pass this back to John, and he's going to kind of take it from here as far as your role.
So this is the really important part of Title II, where it's really the only time that people who have a disability are specifically asked to come forward and share your view. It's easy enough for us to go through a site and share the dimensions with the city, with the Parks and Recreation Department, but it's really about how you view this from the perspective of what should be the priorities. It's consistent with the mantra from the adoption of the Americans with Disabilities Act, nothing about us without us. So coming up here after one more slide is going to be a chance to hear from you about what you think the priority is. The next slide just talks about what's next for the department. The staff are going to be digesting the site reports and our transition plan recommendation, which is quite a bit for each site. We will include public feedback, both from this session as well as from the survey, and that will give the department a sense of what the public thinks. And then I mentioned earlier that the department, I think, has done a great job as far as making programs and sites accessible. So I'm going to say that they will continue to do the same thing and implement the accessibility and inclusion principles within the Americans with Disabilities Act. But now we really want to hear from you about whether any of the factors that we talked about earlier resonated with you, or if you have other things that you think, other factors that you think should help the department determine what gets retrofit for accessibility first. So Patty, I think we were going to tag team on this, and you're going to read comments aloud, and then we'll have a discussion about those.
I'm here, John. I believe, though, you can read the in the Q&A. Can you see the comments that are coming in? I believe there might be one.
I see one. One of the attendees today said,
I'm coming.
the priority for me is definitely making parks and creating programs that individuals with disabilities can enjoy without limitations. So that's a great comment. I think to a certain extent that that's consistent with the Title II requirement for existing sites. Kersey, what we're also looking for, though, is, I'm just going to use a couple of examples here. If I'm looking at a park, is it more important for me to make parking accessible and the route to the playground and the sports fields accessible? Or should I focus on the playground and make it accessible? And should I focus on the sport field and make it accessible? So we want to make all of those accessible, but which ones first? And we have an answer here. It would be lovely to have the playground accessible. So playground accessibility is a key part of our recommendations. Playgrounds are complex spaces that have to balance both safety as well as accessibility. That said, there are numerous examples, including in Port St. Lucie, of playground assets, play components that are compliant. I'll say also that the playground industry as a whole, certainly American manufacturers, have done a good job of incorporating the accessibility requirements into playground design. We've got another comment here. A few years ago, I went to a park and I was able to enjoy the playground along with my niece and nephew. I think what the person means to say is I didn't feel limited. And that should be the goal at a playground or a sport field or a swimming pool. Other comments?
That's all I'm seeing right now, John.
Patty, I think this is a good time to remind people of the survey. It sounds like one of the attendees has already participated in the survey. Can you talk about where they can see the survey and how they can provide feedback to the department through the survey?
Yes, give me a second.
Yes, John, just give me 1 second, okay?
Sure.
All right, thanks for waiting while we got our technology working. Yes, I do want to remind everyone there is a survey, very, very brief survey that is available online. Please go to the city's website at www.cityofpsl.com and you'll see the Parks and Recreation tab, and just click on that tab and you will see the American with Disabilities. It'll advertise this meeting, and in that meeting notice you'll see the survey. So the survey will be open, I believe, until around July 12th. Between now and then, we'll collect all of the results. And like John said, that's going to be part of our next process. Once we get the audits from WT Group, we'll take the public engagement comments via this meeting as well as the survey results, and we'll take all of that into account as we incorporate this into our ADA transition plan.
Patty, it sounds like the survey is also on Facebook.
Yes, it is. It is also on Facebook.
Great. I've mentioned the department several times, so I'll start the wind up here with, a compliment to the department. That the department has done a good job of addressing this. Not every Parks and Recreation agency across the country has developed a transition plan. So I think that's important. And I think Patty's made it clear too, along with the acting director of Parks and Recreation, that they want your feedback. So don't feel as if your opportunity to provide feedback about accessibility for people with disabilities or inclusion of people with disabilities is limited just to this event or to the survey. The department wants to hear from you on an ongoing basis. And, I would encourage you to make them aware of how your quality of life is affected by the parks and facilities and programs that they provide. Patty, it's been a pleasure to work with the department. We're not done yet. And we look forward to giving you reports and recommendations that you can implement and, as the commenter said, make the beautiful Port St. Lucie parks and facilities truly accessible to all.
Thank you, John, and Shelley as well. I do want to take a moment because that is very important to us, John. We are very committed here in Parks and Recreation to doing just that. That's why we embarked on this journey, because again, like John said through this presentation, it's the right thing to do. And there are many of us, myself included, who do have disabilities. And yet I want to get out. I need to get out into our parks and into the beauty that we offer here. So we're committed to this, and but it will be an endeavor. But we're passionate about making these amenities that we offer available to anyone and everyone, regardless of ability. So I want to thank John and Shelley for joining us tonight. I also want to thank our sign language interpreter, who's doing a phenomenal job, and our technology assistant, Avi Monina from our communications department. Couldn't do this without him. But most importantly, I do want to express my gratitude to those of you who took time out tonight to join this discussion. I hope you learned something. I know I did. I do every time I hear Mr. McGovern on the ADA and Title II. So thank you all for coming. Please, again, visit the website. And if you haven't, fill out the survey. We'd love to hear your responses. And have a safe and enjoyable evening. Thank you all.